The old picture houses were going. The tin sheds, the converted skating rinks. The greatest expansion in cinema had begun, and its outward signs were the box-like structures which began to appear in every shopping strip, buildings designed especially for the movies. New theatres were going up in Lidcombe, Taree, Gundagai and Nyngan, in Coorparoo, Narromine and Cumnock. In the 1920s, Australia had one of the highest rates of picture going of any country in the world. Why? It was a belief held with some truth that movies were the working man's entertainment. Australia was one of the few countries to have a basic or minimum wage, and certainly the only one to reckon the cost of a weekly visit to the pictures for a man, his wife and 2 children a factor in its calculation. Only the better off could afford 10 shillings for a seat at live theatre, but there were few who could not find a shilling or sixpence for the pictures. The smallest centre had its picture show, the projector standing naked in the local hall or in a bio box built on to the back. Open-air theatres were common in the warmer regions. Engrossed audiences ignored the discomforts. Travelling showmen were on the move right through the silent era. They stuck to their circuits in the back blocks, bringing to families in the little bush towns their only taste of the sophisticated delights of the silver sheet. The silent projector clacked and whirred in the remotest parts of Australia, in Alice Springs, in the mining town of Mount Isa, in the pearling town of Broome. Japanese in one section, Aboriginals in another, in the covered lounge, the whites. When the McRobertson expedition drove around Australia in 1928, it reported,
"We were frequently asked to give 8-hour shows, as a great number of the people had never before seen moving pictures. And it may be several years before they again have the opportunity."
Canberra had a picture theatre when it had little else. Although Franklin Barrett, who ran the theatre for its first year, called Canberra the showman's grave because he was forbidden to display any posters. Nearly all picture theatres in Australia were built between 1920 and 1930, increasing in size and grandeur as the decade wore on. The Melbourne Capitol, remarkable avant-garde creation of Walter Burley Griffin, designer of Canberra. In 1924, unlike any other theatre in Australia. Inside the auditorium, a whole ceiling of light, still one of the wonders of theatre architecture. From thousands of concealed lamps, colour flowed, pulsating, changing, controlled by a light console which played before the show and during the interval. The atmospheric theatres, copied from America, created a different dream world. The Sydney Capitol was designed as a Mediterranean villa. Copies of famous statues were brought from Italy. Pigeons were specially bred and stuffed. The ceilings of atmospherics gave the effect of a star-studded sky, across which clouds perpetually drifted, projected from a machine called the Brenograph Jr. All styles, all periods were plundered for the movie palace, unique creation of the 1920s. What was the magic which packed these theatres, drew people often 2 and 3 times a week? America had begun film production on a scale never before attempted, and she set out to capture a world market for her product. She was so successful in Australia that year after year we were one of her best customers, sometimes achieving what the Sydney Bulletin called the inglorious distinction of being her best. But in 1920, Hollywood was only just getting into its stride. To Australian filmmakers, flushed with the success of The Sentimental Bloke, prospects seemed high. One producer, E.J. Carroll, even set out to capture some of the American market. He advertised his aims. Carroll formed a partnership with Snowy Baker, famous Australian horseman and athlete, who had starred in 2 earlier films. They imported an American director, scriptwriter and cameraman for the first time in our film history. Wilfred Lucas, the director, was well known in Hollywood. Bess Meredith, his wife, was just coming into prominence as a screenwriter and was to become one of the most successful in Hollywood. The cameraman, Robert Dorrer, had worked for some of the biggest American directors. After research, Bess Meredith came to the conclusion that the only possible stories for Australian films were those of station and bush life. In the first film, Snowy played the role of a parson. When his attachment to a young lady becomes too obvious, her jealous guardian stirs up the townspeople to demand that he be transferred. The heroine was played by American actress Brownie Vernon. Even in his new parish, the hero can't avoid trouble. The heroine is abducted by the Guardian's station hands. To protect his sweetheart, the young parson is forced to fight in earnest. The Man from Kangaroo was a success. Carroll and Baker pressed on. They had acquired an old mansion at Waverley, Sydney, with extensive grounds. They built a well-equipped indoor studio and an outdoor stage. 2 more films were made. They were all popular in Australia, but our critics found them too American. Smith's Weekly.
The film is almost pure Yankee. A foreigner seeing this would picture Australia as a sort of Will Hart's backyard.
The Bulletin.
It simply couldn't happen in Australia. In our back blocks, the parson is as inevitable as the drought.
However, in America, the films had favorable reviews. The Motion Picture News called The Man from Kangaroo
A picture which is far above the standard of the ordinary Western.
Immediately after the 3rd film, Wilfred Lucas returned to America with Bess Meredith. Snowy went too to try his luck in Hollywood. The films were to be distributed in America and Europe by a Chicago corporation. It was expected they would net $50,000 from America alone. But the money would be slow coming in, too slow. And when it came, too little. The bitter explanation came some years later, when the United States authorities began criminal proceedings against the corporation and found it had swindled the firm, among others, out of substantial profits. For E.J. Carroll, it was too late. He had abandoned his attempt to make films for the American market in the mistaken belief that it was not profitable. The enterprise which had begun so bravely under the Australian sun had ended in the doctored books of a Chicago company. Carroll decided to concentrate on films for the local and English markets. In charge of the Waverley Studios, he placed leading Australian director Raymond Longford. With his partner, Lottie Lyle, Longford had proved he could make good money for his backers through his policy of making pictures with strong appeal to Australians, rather than chasing a vague general appeal. He now followed the successful On Our Selection with another Rudd family film. a satire on its more prosperous days. Tragically, not a single Longford 20s film survives, even though he was to make 7. He showed his versatility with his next film, a society drama based on an Australian novel. The cameraman was again Arthur Higgins, Longford's constant favourite. Lottie Lyle wrote the scenario and helped with direction. Critical opinion was unanimous. Compares favourably with the best American screenplays. And, to prove the point, the film was a success in America. When the film was finished, the Carrolls announced that they would cease production. The clue to their action lay in the fact that they were also film exhibitors.
Mr. Carroll informed me that the outlook for local production was dark. As part owner of some Queensland theatres, he depended on the Combine for his supply of film, and as they were opposed to local production, it would be impossible for him to continue should they cease supplies.
Longford decided to form his own company, in partnership with Lottie Lyle. The first film was based on a screenplay they wrote together. The leading player was the gifted Arthur Towshett, busiest screen actor of the decade. The Dinkum Bloke was said by a number of reviewers to be the best film made in Australia, better than The Sentimental Bloke. In England, it was retitled A Gentleman in Mufti, was highly praised in reviews, and was released profitably by Gaumont. The Longford-Lyle company proved short-lived. The other directors forced the company's liquidation for reasons which they never made clear. Determined to go on, Longford found a private backer for 3 low-budget features. Fisher's Ghost, based on the sensational real-life occurrence, cost £1,000, ridiculously low, even for that time. The picture screened to packed houses, and in the first week netted £1,200, of which the producers were paid 30. 120's director almost did make a go of continuous production. English Algie and his cousin are in Sydney on their way to New Zealand, where an uncle has left them each a property. Algie, an innocent abroad, doesn't know that the one who gets to New Zealand first has a choice of properties. He has been doped by his cousin to delay his departure. When a young journalist in Adelaide, Beaumont Smith had formed a stage company. During a lean period, he turned to filmmaking, using his actors in 2 real comedies about a rural family, the Hayseeds. One of his leading players was Roy Redgrave, father of Sir Michael Redgrave. Through 17 silent features, Beau Smith never made a financial failure. Everyone's, the film journal, wrote,
"There are some who sneer at Beau Smith's films, but it is a fact that they have all made money for him and for the showmen who have screened them. And what more could any man ask?"
In 1925, even he abandoned plans for his next feature and went over to distribution, stating that rewards for Australian films were harder and harder to come by and were not commensurate with the expense involved. Franklin Barrett, a leading silent director, made only 3 films after 1920. The most highly praised It starred New Zealand actress Vera James, who went on to a busy career in Hollywood. The film had a social theme, unusual for Australian films, the problem of a woman with an illegitimate child. Barrett's films were of a high standard. He'd been a cameraman since the turn of the century and photographed his films as well. But he, too, closed his production office and went over to exhibition. Despite the high mortality rate of film companies, there was always someone game for a try. Arthur Shirley, an Australian actor who had played leading roles in Hollywood and who once shared a dressing room with Valentino. Back home, he embarked on production with high hopes. His first film, The Throwback, ran into financial difficulties and was never completed. His next film, The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, was a hit. Despite its popularity and that of a later film, he failed to raise money to go on. J.P. Ramster, who combined film directing with running a school of acting. He usually employed his own pupils. Harry Southwell, former Vitagraph director, shrewdly exploiting the fascination for Australians of the Ned Kelly story. He had made one version in 1919 and now made a second. The film was banned in New South Wales for fear that the police would be held up to ridicule. Southwell recut the film, to its detriment, according to everyone's. Despite the film's critical and actual mauling, such was the popularity of the subject that it was still making money on the country circuits in 1929. If the directors were more often out of work than in, the cameramen were in steady demand, thanks to the weekly output of news gazettes. Travelogues were popular. The cameramen worked on their own, covering the continent for private or government sponsors. By the end of the 20s, there was hardly a corner where the movie camera had not been. Few of these films aimed higher than simple reporting. But the mere fact of their survival has given them a reality deeper than their makers dreamt of. A portrait of a vanished, naive Australia. When the Duke and Duchess of York came to open federal parliament in 1927. A few more ambitious factual films were attempted. One of the best was sponsored by the New South Wales Forestry Department. It was photographed by Lacey Percival. Francis Birtles had been an overland traveller and explorer since the early 1900s, often making films of his journeys. His story film was unusual for its time in its sympathetic identification with Aboriginal life. Koorab has disobeyed his tribal elders and must be punished by spending a night on the dreaded Island of Ghosts. One actuality filmmaker stood out above all others, Frank Hurley, superb still and movie photographer, his own director, writer, editor, intrepid adventurer, lover of the rich and strange. Already famous for his Antarctic films, he made a travel film in New Guinea. It was a sensation, with its revelation of society still largely unknown to the outside world. Shown in London, Pearls and Savages persuaded film magnate Sir Oswald Stoll to back Hurley in 2 features, using the authentic locations he had explored for travel films. Papua gave Hurley the inspiration for the first, although he was forced to make it in Dutch New Guinea. He used Australian actress Grace Severi for the lead, but the warriors were real. Despite excellent returns from the two films in England and release in Australian cities by Union Theatres, plans for further features collapsed from lack of finance, and Hurley returned to actuality filmmaking. Why were so many directors forced to give up? Why should the Green Room Journal say in a bitter editorial,
"The picture industry in Australia today is a joke"?
Even when he had made a film, the Australian producer found himself an outcast from a tightly controlled system of distribution, the contract or block booking system, developed by America and exploited by her with success all over the world. Theatre owners contracted with an importing agency to take its product for 6 or 12 months or more. They were contracting for films they had not seen, often films which had not even been made. So-called special films were kept off the regular schedule, and for these the showman had to pay extra. Two firms, tied to American distribution, between them owned most of the city first-release theatres. Smaller exhibitors were caught in the toils of the system, overhead to maintain, houses to fill, dependent on the importers for a steady supply of films. Australian producers had to pay for all their own publicity, as well as for the American film they had persuaded the exhibitor to set aside. By the time expenses were deducted, there was often little left. The producers had support from an extraordinarily varied cross-section of public opinion.
It is deplorable that a country with such a record should submit quietly to foreign exploitation, have its individualism undermined and its character and ideals practically shaped for it by a battering invasion of American films.
If the government is subsidising airway companies, why shouldn't they subsidise Australian film producers as well? Theirs is also a pioneer work.
It is not desirable that young Australians should grow up with the impression that Uncle Sam's morbid republic is the whole globe, a globe inhabited by superheated women and supermen.
The picture industry is a menace to the prestige and trade of the British Empire.
Without disparaging American culture, we would prefer to keep our own.
Censorship was a much debated issue. The figures for juvenile crime had increased with the movies. The figures had decreased with the movies. A boy from the Newcastle district was ordered by a magistrate to stay away from picture shows for 12 months, Smith's Weekly.
If Skinny's case is to be the first of many similar punishments, then sly film joints will spring up all over the place. They will be disguised as high schools.
Undeterred by the heartbreaks of others, new directors came forward. Louise Lovely, one of a few women who made courageous attempts at production in the 20s. Born in Paddington, Sydney, of French parentage, the vivacious Louise Carbus had been acting since she was a child and took part in some of the earliest filmmaking in Australia. She married a fellow actor and they went to Hollywood. Her name was changed to Louise Lovely. She became a star. With her husband, she came home, formed a company and embarked on a film adapted from an Australian novel. A young society girl rebels against a loveless marriage. She disguises herself as a boy and runs away to the forests of Tasmania, where she tries to find herself, sharing the rough life of some miners. A young miner comes to her protection and guesses her true sex. The hero of Jewelled Nights was played by Gordon Collingridge, our only real screen idol of the 20s. A good deal of the film was shot on remote location in the myrtle forests of the Savage River in Tasmania. Louise Lovely and her husband followed the methods they knew from Hollywood. 2 separate negatives were made, one for the English market and one for the American. Taz Higgins and Wally Sully shot side by side, just as in Hollywood. Ironically, the film was never released abroad. Of a cost of £8,000, only £5,000 were recovered, and Louise Lovely was forced to abandon further production plans. Another young Australian was back from Hollywood, one who had been born and bred in the Queensland cattle country. A few years before, he had pestered Snowy Baker for a job, eventually getting one as labourer, bit player, then assistant director. Charles Chevelle. Now, with 15 months' experience in Hollywood behind him, he formed a production company in his home state. Intelligent, articulate, Chevelle had definite ideas about the kind of films he believed should be made here.
I think it's futile for Australian producers to attempt society or costume dramas. My aim is to produce films relying mainly on our open spaces for story inspiration and for natural light and settings.
Dell, the moth of Moonby selection, is left some money on the death of her father. Dell samples the joys of an idle city life. Moth of Moonby was well reviewed, although it was not until Chevelle's next feature that the Bulletin spotted one of our future outstanding directors.
There's a bit too much Hollywood inspiration in his pictures. But the talent is there and he should go far.
Rather different ideas from those of Chevelle were held by three young Sydney women, the McDonough sisters.
We wanted to alter the whole image of picture making in Australia, the old Dad and Dave image.
The girls had watched American films, sometimes 3 and 4 times over, had studied the acting, the editing, the backgrounds. Isabel, the elder sister, was leading actress under her stage name of Marie Lorraine. Paulette McDonough was the writer-director. She engaged the best actors.
I knew what I wanted from them, and that was underacting, restraint. What they wanted to give me was stage technique. It was very hard to get actors to take advice from a young girl. I said, you may be famous on the stage, but this is a new medium, and you have to learn. I showed them their first day's rushes. They came to heel like lambs.
McDonough's first film, Now Lost, was the only film, apart from The Sentimental Bloke, to be invariably praised by all who mentioned it at the Royal Commission in 1927. Their later work shows a delicacy and sensitivity not always evident in Australian films, and a sure grasp of film technique. Cherry Carson waits for some word from her lover, unaware that her father is determined to prevent their meeting. Perhaps alarmed by the anti-American feeling in the film debate, the largest distributing firm began feature production. Australasian Films, popularly known as the Combine. The firm was disappointed with its first film, made by an American director. It invited Raymond Longford to take charge of production at its new studios at Bondi Junction. The managing director made a press statement.
We think that today Mr. Longford is the dominant figure in Australian production, but for many years he has laboured under great difficulties because he had no big organisation behind him.
Longford's first assignment was a film of a novel by Catherine Susanna Pritchard. While he was making it, the death occurred of Lottie Lyle. She had been in films since 1911, as leading actress and as production partner to Longford. Everyone's called her one who has left the mark of her genius on Australian screen progress. Longford recommended that the firm purchase the rights of a famous Australian novel, a story of convict days. He was engaged to direct. His son Victor worked hard preparing a script. The co-writer was Dorothy Gordon, later well known as the columnist Andrea. Meanwhile, Leonard Roos, a Canadian cameraman, had returned to the film capital after making travelogues in Australia. He wanted to go back. His friend Norman Dawn, director and cameraman, had a liking for filming in far-off places. Australia might be good for a working holiday. Everyone's April 1926.
By Orangi, May 29th, Mr. Dawn is scheduled for Sydney. Len Roos accompanies him as chief cinematographer.
On his arrival, Dawn announced that he would make feature films here, with leading players from America.
I have several stories okayed by powerful releasing organizations in America.
Whatever the stories were, for the term of his natural life was not among them. Dawn had never heard of the book. 6 weeks later,
Mr. Balcombe of Australasian Films asked me to make a sacrifice and hand over the picture to Mr. Dawn, his explanation being that, if produced by an American with American artists, it would be sure of an American release.
Longford could not but agree. In a deluge of publicity never before given any Australian feature, Dawn set to work. He imported American actors for the leads, with local supporting players, 2 local cameramen, and hundreds of extras, destined to be convicts or warders. Dawn attended to every detail with the confidence of one who knew he could afford it. James Tyrrell, antique expert, was engaged to find furniture and props exactly in period. The costumes were copied from originals preserved in the Hobart Museum. Musicians played throughout the shooting. Whatever Dawn wanted, Australasian Films bedazzled gave him. They were backing him to the official sum of £50,000. Such largesse was unheard of in local production, and in relative terms has never been equalled since. Yet Dawn's skill was impressive. He had been a pioneer of special effects, and he put them all to use. Miniature ceilings, matte shots. The 2 Australian cameramen, Bert Cross and William Trerice, saw for the first time camera rostrums and glass shots used to rebuild the old convict prison of Port Arthur, Tasmania. Dawn rejected the script and worked straight from the book. While individual scenes were incredibly faithful to the novel, the overall result was a meandering structure, confusing to follow. However, in the incomplete copy which survives, the vast scope of the story, its use of dramatic locations, the strength of the acting, all combine to make a film which at times verges on greatness. The escaped convict, Gabbett, turns cannibal, the desperation of man matched by the wildness of the landscape. The scene where Rufus Dawes, called as a witness in a trial, recognizes the girl whose life he saved, but who has long forgotten him. The convict riot sequence, its low-key lighting and rhythmic use of crowd movement, reminiscent of the work of German directors. Was an immediate hit, thanks to the publicity, and not least to Australasian Film's guaranteed release through its city theatres and its own circuits. The firm, jubilant, allowed Dawn to press on. This film was shot mainly on location in Fiji. Just 2 years later, Australasian Films admitted that it had lost £30,000 on the two films, and that neither film had made a penny overseas, frustrated by that very system of contract booking which operated to the firm's advantage in Australia. Disillusionment with Dawn had set in, but it was too late to make amends to Longford. The pitiless fiasco of Term marked a downward trend in his career, and he was never to regain his former standing in the industry.
Motion before the House that in the opinion of the Senate, a royal commission with power to send for persons and papers and to move from place to place shall be appointed to inquire into and report upon the moving picture industry in Australia. Question resolved in the affirmative.
Are you aware that with the Australian market largely in the hands of the picture companies, it's exceedingly difficult to obtain the release of British or Australian pictures?
Well, I know of no combine. On the contrary, I believe the picture interests in Australia are in the hands of the keenest businessmen I've met.
Well, it's been said that more than 90% of the pictures shown are American.
That is so.
You are opposed to the quota system as a method of giving assistance?
Yes. No one should be forced to show anything he does not want to show.
You do not consider block booking in advance immoral?
Certainly not. It is good business.
I swear to tell the truth. I swear to tell the truth.
Manager. Magistrate.
Policeman.
Teacher.
Film producer. Not the editor. The good films league. Journalist.
Do you think Australians are capable of producing films equal to those produced in Hollywood?
I think an Australian is capable of anything.
Do you think the government should assist in building up film production in Australia?
Most decidedly. I don't blame the Americans for what they're doing. They do merely what we allow them to do.
At the present time, you're not engaged in production?
No, and I see no hope of being engaged in production, in spite of my record.
You view favourably the appointment of this commission?
It's our only hope. I know that if we fail this time, we are gone.
One of my main objections to the quota system is that it would spell disaster to the industry from the public's point of view. I maintain that Australians would resent entertainment presented to them under regulations.
The impression I have gathered is that you would rather leave things as they are, being well satisfied that the people of Australia are magnificently supplied with imported films.
The welfare of the general public must be taken into consideration.
Our national
quota, Commonwealth subsidy,
national moral well-being,
uniform sense,
combine,
national
The evidence which has been given shows that producers cannot obtain the necessary capital to make Australian pictures because they're unable to get screenings.
Any film will get a screening if it is up to standard.
Anyone can say a film is not up to standard.
You realize that a government subsidy would have to take into consideration pictures that have international appeal.
Well, it depends on what is international appeal. Does it mean we must make pictures similar to those that are made at Hollywood? If we did, they would not have international appeal. The only way in which we can give an Australian picture an international appeal is to make it Australian.
Were the Australian films you have shown successful?
Well, I've done better with those than with the American. I've never yet dropped on one.
Are you convinced that moving pictures have a pernicious effect on the child mind?
There is no doubt about it.
I take the view that pictures are a very great boon to children, that their mental development is improved and not retarded by seeing them.
Speaking not only as a censor, but as a professor of literature, I say it would be disastrous to censor all films in such a way as to make them suitable for children.
My view is that children are probably a great deal better off in a theatre than roaming the streets and getting into all sorts of mischief.
The German quota is 1 for 1.
The British quota will take effect in a year's time.
The duty paid does not show the true earning value of the film.
Showmen are not free to speak as they feel.
We have failed to find any evidence of a combine.
Do you think that the showing of a large percentage of American films is having an anti-British influence on the Australian people?
I think that American films are lowering our standard of family life.
How should we overcome that?
By producing our own pictures.
Should we import producers and stars from America?
No. We don't go to America for lawyers and other professional men.
I earnestly protest against there being no woman on this commission. The government did a serious injustice to 1/2 of Australia's population.
What, in your opinion, should be the chief reason for the establishment of the motion picture industry in Australia?
Because there's a lot of money in it.
The Commonwealth spends £100,000 per annum advertising Australia. The motion picture could do better work at less cost.
When I saw the dinkum bloke in New York, I went and hid in a speakeasy for the rest of the day.
A quota system is the only one that will ensure stability during a country's developmental years of production.
Wouldn't a quota benefit the laboratories?
No. It would only create more book debts.
Oh, don't Australian producers pay?
Hardly. They're not yet in that position.
While the film industry awaited the outcome of the Royal Commission, production had fallen to an all-time low. Studios were idle, directors returned to living on hopes and plans. The golden years of Hollywood were often the grim years in other film-producing countries of the world.
Meanwhile, more people than ever were going to the pictures. More money was being spent to lure them in. Music had always been an integral part of silent film presentation. By now, the largest theatres had 2 orchestras, the pit band and the stage band, big as a symphony orchestra. The mighty theatre organ played in concert. It became a popular performer in its own right. Organists were advertised as special attractions, darlings of the movie crowds. Conductors were equally feted. They often arranged their own scores for films. The best of them raised the accompaniment of silent films to a high art. Supporting stage presentations ranged from grand opera, the Australian premiere of Rhapsody in Blue, all-girl bands, all-boy bands, the standard variety acts, and the famous theatre ballets. Theatres like Sydney's Capitol mounted a new stage show every week.
It was the proud boast of Stuart Doyle that Australian workmen had built the greatest picture palace of them all, the Sydney State. which opened in 1929.
For the second time, the Premier's Conference, sitting in Canberra, has refused to cede state powers to the Commonwealth to enable the federal government to put the recommendations of the Film Commission into full effect. That further postpones action on the Empire quota, the grading of pictures for children, and the abolition of block booking.
Are you laughing at me?
While the government deliberated, our production industry had been made obsolete overnight. The most important recommendations of the Royal Commission, including an Empire film quota, were never put into effect. Almost alone among the filmmaking countries of the world, Australia had failed to bring down legislation to protect her infant industry. Australian filmmaking of the 20s. A small-scale, homespun, uncertain industry. More than 100 features were made, but they were a drop in the ocean of the thousands upon thousands of American imports. The kind of thing we did best on our low budgets was homely comedy. Kid Steaks was made by actor and writer Tal Ordell. For all its apparent simplicity, a fast-paced film in which the action, plot and business never flag.